The lunch whistle hit, and every man on the floor moved the same direction, toward the smell of grease, coffee, and whatever the cafeteria line had going that day. You sat down, you ate, and you went back to work. Here are 30 meals American factories served their workers in the 1970s. Before the factory cafeteria became standard, every working man in America carried the same thing through the plant gates, a dome-top metal lunch pail with a wide-mouth thermos tucked inside the upper shelf. His wife filled it the night before, usually with Campbell's chicken noodle or tomato, sometimes vegetable beef if the week had been long. The thermos was steel on the outside and glass-lined within, fragile enough that one hard drop on the shop floor would crack the vacuum seal and turn lunch into a lukewarm disappointment. You learned to set it down carefully and pray nobody kicked it during second shift. The soup was never hot by noon, warm at best, but it was yours, packed in the same kitchen where your kids ate breakfast. Over 120 million metal lunch boxes sold between 1950 and 1970, and nearly everyone rode to a factory or a mill. By the late 70s, plastic replaced the steel, and the heft of a real lunch pail slipped away for good. There was a time when every factory cafeteria in the industrial Midwest ran the same plate: 2 slices of white bread laid flat, thinly sliced roast beef draped over the top, instant mashed potatoes on the side, and the whole thing drowned in brown gravy from a steel ladle. They called it a Manhattan or an open-face hot beef, and nobody cared what name it went by as long as the gravy was hot. The dish traces back to 1915, when railway dining cars ran daily specials on divided blue plates to save on dishwashing. By the 70s, it was standard cafeteria architecture: cheap cuts cooked low and slow since early morning, sliced thin enough to pass for tender. The gravy hid the dryness, the cut quality, the fact that the bread had gone completely soft. None of that mattered at 12:15 on a Tuesday in a stamping plant outside Detroit, when that plate was the only warm thing between you and 4 more hours on the line. They don't make gravy like that in factories anymore, mostly because they don't make much of anything in factories anymore. The truck pulled into the lot around 11:30, and the horn was the only announcement it needed. They called them roach coaches, not because anyone loved the name, but because the reputation had stuck since the 50s, when catering trucks started parking outside shipyards with menus in grease pencil on the side panel. The chili was always the move. It came out of a steel pot bolted to the counter, ladled into a styrofoam cup with a plastic spoon jammed in, and it burned your hand through the cup before you got the first bite. Nobody asked what cut of meat was in it. The original mobile food service traced to 1872, when a man named Walter Scott parked a covered wagon outside a newspaper office in Providence, Rhode Island, and started selling sandwiches through a cutout window. 100 years later, the chili hadn't changed much. Thick, salty, heavy on the cumin. You ate it standing up in the parking lot, talking about overtime, and the wind carried the smell across the whole second shift. The coffee break was not a kindness, it was a negotiation. The first corporate coffee break on record traces to 1902, when Barcolo Manufacturing in Buffalo, New York, gave workers a paid pause and a free cup to keep production moving. By the 70s, the morning break cart was standard in every plant with more than 100 employees. A steel urn brewing since 4 in the morning, styrofoam cups, powdered creamer in a cardboard canister, and a tray of cheese Danish wrapped in cellophane. Nobody called it good coffee. It was hot, it was strong, and you drank it black because the powdered creamer turned it gray. That 15-minute stop, twice a shift, was where gossip moved, friendships formed, and grudges settled between men who otherwise only saw each other through safety goggles. When the company cut it to 10 minutes in '78, the union filed a grievance before the next pot was empty. Long before the break cart rolled through, the cafeteria line was already set, and the most reliable thing on it was Salisbury steak. The patty was ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs and onion powder, pressed flat on a sheet pan, baked in rows, and served under a ladle of brown mushroom gravy from a number 10 can. The mashed potatoes beside it were instant, reconstituted from flakes with hot water and margarine. The dish had a medical name because it was one. Dr. James Salisbury promoted the ground beef patty in the 1880s as a cure for everything from gout to heart trouble. By the 70s, his name had been reduced to a banquet frozen dinner label and a steam table card. But it worked. It was protein, it was warm, and it came with enough gravy to make the texture irrelevant. Men who had been running presses all morning didn't need elegance. They needed it ready. You either grew up with liverwurst or you didn't, and there was no converting anyone after the age of 12. The men who carried it to the factory floor packed it the same way every time. 2 slices of dark rye, a thick spread straight from the tube, a smear of yellow mustard, and maybe a leaf of iceberg lettuce if the wife was feeling generous. Liverwurst was a German import, a sausage made from ground pork liver and fat, soft enough to spread like paste and rich enough that one sandwich carried a man through a 10-hour shift. Oscar Mayer sold it alongside bologna at every deli counter in the country, and its popularity held from the 40s through the late 70s. The men who ate it never apologized for it. The smell alone cleared a radius at the lunch table, and that was the appeal. Liverwurst was a membership card, a line between the men who came from those kitchens and the ones who didn't. It vanished from mainstream delis by the 2000s. The steam table was the heart of every factory cafeteria, a long stainless steel counter fitted with rectangular wells of hot water, each one holding a deep pan of something cooking since before dawn. The beef stew sat in the center well because it moved the fastest. Carrots, potatoes, onions, and chunks of beef that had started tough and gone soft after hours of low heat, swimming in a dark broth, thickened with flour and seasoned with enough salt to keep a man on his feet. By the mid-70s, sneeze guards had become mandatory in most states. Massachusetts ordered them for every cafeteria in 1975, and the glass shield became as familiar as the food behind it. But before the guards went up, you could lean over that stew and let the steam hit your face, and the older workers swore that was the best part of lunch, standing in line, breathing it in, letting the heat cut through whatever the shop floor had done to them. The stew never changed. The men who ate it did. Not every plant had a cafeteria. The smaller operations, machine shops, tool and die outfits, warehouses with under 50 workers, got a bank of vending machines bolted to the break room wall, and that was lunch. The sandwich was always the same. 2 slices of white bread, a layer of processed ham or turkey, a square of American cheese, and a smear of mayonnaise, sealed in cellophane on a slowly rotating shelf behind glass. You put in your quarters, turned the chrome knob, and the little door popped open. The bread was damp from refrigeration, the cheese too orange, and the whole thing tasted like last week. The concept traced back to Horn and Hard Arts automats, which served 350,000 people a day in New York before fast food replaced them. None of that charm survived in the factory version. Just fluorescent light, humming compressors, and a sandwich that existed because someone had to eat between shifts. The men who had served called it by its military name, and the men who hadn't learned it from the men who had. Creamed chipped beef on toast showed up in factory cafeterias across the Rust Belt with the regularity of payday. Dried beef sliced thin, fried in butter until the edges curled, folded into a white gravy of flour, milk, and black pepper, poured over toast that went soft the second the gravy touched it. The recipe first appeared in the 1910 Manual for Army Cooks, calling for 15 pounds of beef to feed 60 men. Factory kitchens scaled it down and kept the method. Stouffer's launched a frozen version in the early 60s that sold for decades. In the cafeteria, though, it was never frozen. Made that morning by a woman who didn't need a recipe card because the proportions lived in her hands. When she retired, the new cook used a measuring cup, and every man on the floor said it tasted different. The cafeteria ran bean soup on Wednesdays because the ham bones from Monday's lunch had been simmering since dawn, and by midweek the broth was dark and thick and impossible to shortcut. Navy beans or Great Northerns, a few chunks of carrot, and the ham bone sitting at the bottom of the pot like an anchor. The cornbread came from a sheet pan, cut in squares, dense and golden with a crust that crumbled when you broke it and a center warm enough to melt the margarine they left in foil packets at the end of the line. This was Depression-era logic carried into a 1973 assembly plant. Stretch the protein, fill the belly, waste nothing. A bowl and 2 squares of cornbread cost less than $1, and it outweighed half the menu. The men who grew up on it understood what it meant to eat well on almost nothing. The same hands that simmered bones for bean soup also rolled meatballs in factory towns where Italian families had settled 3 generations deep, places like Youngstown, Pittsburgh, and the neighborhoods south of Detroit. The meatball sub didn't come from the cafeteria. It came from the sandwich counter across the street, run by a family that had been there since the grandfather came over, and it was the lunch you bought on Friday when the paycheck hit. 3 or 4 meatballs in red sauce on a split Italian roll, the bread soaking through by the time you carried it across the parking lot, the sauce running down your wrist. The meatballs were beef and pork held together with stale bread soaked in milk, a technique the old women called a panade without ever using the word. Those lunch counters ran on margins so thin a slow Friday could end them. Most didn't survive the plant closures of the early 80s, and the ones that did never tasted the same without a factory crowd to feed. It came north with the workers who came north, Southern men and women who followed the factory jobs to Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana during the 40s and 50s, bringing a way of cooking that ran on cast iron, hot oil, and flour dredge. Chicken fried steak was a cheap cut of round, pounded thin until the fibers broke, dipped in egg and seasoned flour, and fried until the crust went golden and cracked when you cut into it. The gravy was made in the same pan, drippings, flour, milk, black pepper, nothing else. Factory cafeterias picked it up because the ingredients cost almost nothing. By the 70s, it sat in the rotation alongside Salisbury steak and roast beef. But the men from Tennessee and Alabama could always tell the difference between the cafeteria version and the one their mothers made. The crust was never quite as crisp, the gravy never quite as peppery, and the kitchen it came from never smelled like home. She made the meatloaf on Sunday, and by Tuesday it was lunch. 2 thick slices cut cold from the refrigerator, laid on white bread with a smear of yellow mustard and maybe a leaf of lettuce going soft at the edges, wrapped in wax paper and tucked into the pail beside a hard-boiled egg and a piece of fruit nobody ever ate. The meatloaf was ground beef stretched with saltine crackers, an egg, and a pour of ketchup that doubled as the glaze, baked in a loaf pan until the top cracked and the kitchen smelled like every weeknight in America. Cold, it was better than hot. The texture firmed up, the flavors settled, and the ketchup crust held the sandwich together. She packed it after the dishes were done and before the late news, standing at the counter in a kitchen already dark, except for the light over the stove. He never said much about it, but he ate every bite, and the empty wax paper came home folded in the bottom of the pail like a receipt for something neither of them had words for. The canteen window opened at 11 and closed at 1, and the hot dogs had been on the roller grill since before first shift. Oscar Mayer Franks, all beef or mixed, turning slowly under a heat lamp that gave them a shine they didn't earn. You pointed, the woman behind the glass grabbed one with tongs, dropped it in a steamed bun, and slid it across with mustard and relish packets. 50 cents. The old-timers never touched the ketchup, a rule nobody wrote down but everybody followed. In the 70s, Oscar Mayer moved over 200 million pounds of hot dogs a year through American grocery stores, and half seemed to end up in plant canteens or little league stands. The canteen dog was never great. It was fast, cheap, and you could eat 2 standing up with 10 minutes left to argue about the game. If the meatball sub was the Friday splurge, this was the Tuesday penance. Olive loaf, sliced thin at the deli counter, laid on 2 slices of Wonder Bread with mayonnaise and nothing else. The meat was a processed blend of pork, beef, and soy, studded with pimento-stuffed olives coated in milk powder to keep them from sliding during production. Oscar Mayer made the best-known version, though every regional meatpacker had one. It looked strange, smelled faintly sweet, and had a texture somewhere between bologna and a fever dream, but the men who ate it without complaint because it lasted all week. Olive loaf held a quiet place in the American deli case from the 50s through the late 70s, ordered by the quarter pound by women who knew exactly how many sandwiches it would make. Oscar Mayer discontinued it quietly. Most people didn't notice until the space in the cold case filled with something else. In the factory towns running from Philadelphia through Lancaster to Harrisburg, there was a breakfast food that separated the locals from everyone else. Scrapple was pork scraps, trimmings, organ meat, whatever came off the hog that couldn't be sold another way. Ground fine, mixed with cornmeal and buckwheat flour, seasoned with sage, packed into a loaf, chilled, sliced thick, and fried until the outside went dark and the inside stayed soft as porridge. Pennsylvania Dutch families had been making it since the 1700s, when German immigrants brought their taste for panhas across the Atlantic and substituted cornmeal for the wheat flour they couldn't find. It showed up in factory lunch pails across the mid-Atlantic for decades, fried that morning and wrapped in wax paper. You either knew Scrapple or you had never heard of it. The men who grew up on it defended it like a hometown. Anyone who tried it at a factory lunch table for the first time usually didn't try it twice. General Mills launched it in 1971 with 5 flavors: beef noodle, potato stroganoff, hash, rice oriental, and chili tomato. And within a year it was in more American kitchens than any single cookbook. 1 pound of ground beef, 1 box, 1 pan, 30 minutes, dinner for 4. By the mid-70s, the leftovers had migrated to the factory floor. Wives scooped whatever remained into a Tupperware container and set it in the pail beside a can of soda. The men ate it cold or reheated in the break room microwave, scraping the container with a plastic fork. It was never as good the second time. The noodles went soft, the sauce thickened, and the beef lost whatever texture it had managed the night before. But it was a home-cooked meal carried into a place that smelled like machine oil, and that counted for something. The box cost 79 cents. The feeling of eating what your family ate lasted longer. This was the lunch that cleared the table. A man would pull it from his pail, a container of head cheese with a sleeve of saltines, and the younger workers moved to the other end of the bench without a word. Head cheese was not cheese at all. It was the boiled head of a hog, simmered until the meat fell from the bone and the collagen melted into a gelatinous broth, pressed into a mold with vinegar, cooled until it set into a quivering brick of pork and jelly. The old-world butchers used everything: jowl, tongue, ears, snout, and the families who bought it considered it a delicacy, not a leftover. Polish, German, and Lithuanian factory workers in Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Chicago carried it the way other men carried bologna, without ceremony, without apology. It was cheap, protein-dense, and traveled without refrigeration. By the 80s, the delis that made it were closing, the workers who ate it were retiring, and nobody was training their replacements in either trade. After all that meat and gravy, the dessert case at the end of the line was almost an afterthought. But the men who reached for it always reached for the same thing. Coconut cream pie sat under a clear plastic dome, pre-sliced, each wedge topped with whipped cream that had started to weep by mid-morning. The filling was custard, eggs, sugar, milk, and sweetened coconut flake, poured into a blind-baked crust and chilled until it barely held together when the spatula lifted it. The American coconut industry traced to a Philadelphia flour miller named Franklin Baker, who took a payment of fresh coconuts around 1895 and built a supply chain that put coconut into every bakery in the country. 75 years later, his product was still sitting in that pie at the end of that cafeteria line. The slice cost 35 cents. Nobody makes cafeteria pie from scratch anymore. In the steel corridors of Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Gary, Indiana, the cafeteria food told you exactly who worked there. Kielbasa and sauerkraut was a steel mill dish because steel mills were built by Polish hands. And the cafeteria cooks, many of them Polish women from the same neighborhoods, served what the men expected. The kielbasa was garlic-heavy, smoked, and firm enough to slice into thick coins that held their shape on a tray, served alongside sauerkraut braised with caraway seed and a pour of beer from somebody's locker. A swipe of brown mustard, a hunk of rye bread, and that was lunch. The recipe came from the same kitchen those women cooked in at home, scaled up to feed 300 men in 45 minutes. When the mills started closing in the late 70s, the cafeterias went dark first. The women lost their jobs before the men did, and the food that smelled like the old neighborhood went with them. Every Catholic factory town in the Midwest had the same Friday. No meat on the line, fish on every tray. The cafeteria served it battered and fried, usually cod or lake perch depending on what was local, alongside coleslaw and crinkle-cut fries from a 10-pound Cisco bag. The tartar sauce was industrial, but nobody cared because the fish was hot and the breading was crisp, and it was Friday. In towns like Milwaukee, Green Bay, and South Bend, the Friday fish fry was the rhythm of the whole community. Churches ran them, VFW halls ran them, and the factory cafeteria was one more place that understood you didn't serve a man meat on a Friday. It faded as the rules relaxed and the plants thinned out, but in a few towns, the fish fry still holds, run by families who once cooked for the factory line. By the mid-70s, Chinese-American cooking had crossed from the takeout counter into the factory cafeteria, and pepper steak was how it got there. Strips of beef, usually flank or round, sliced thin against the grain, seared fast in a wide pan with green bell peppers, onions, and a sauce built from soy, garlic, and a splash of something sweet that might have been ketchup depending on who was cooking. It came over white rice, sticky enough to hold the sauce, and it looked nothing like what you'd get at an actual Chinese restaurant, but that didn't matter. The dish worked because the sauce gave cheap beef a flavor that brought men back every time it hit the rotation. The cooks learned it from recipe cards distributed by companies like Cisco and ARA Services, not from any grandmother's kitchen. But for a generation of factory workers who had never eaten with chopsticks, that tray of pepper steak was the entire Far East, and they cleaned the plate every time. Third shift ended at 7, and the cafeteria was already serving breakfast when the night crew came through smelling like grease and metal shavings. Corned beef hash was the plate they reached for. Diced corned beef and potatoes fried flat on a griddle until the bottom went crisp, served with 2 eggs cracked over the top and toast cut diagonal. Some plants made it from scratch, chopping yesterday's corned beef and frying it in bacon fat. Most used canned, Hormel or broadcast, scooped from the tin and pressed on the griddle until the edges browned. Either way, it was the last meal of the working day for men whose day started at 11 the night before. They sat at the tables in early morning light, eating slowly, too tired to talk, and when they finished, they drove home on empty roads. The hash tasted different at 7 in the morning. Everything did. If you thought the cellophane ham and cheese was the bottom of the vending machine ladder, you never met the ham salad. It sat on the lowest shelf, behind the egg salad and the tuna, wrapped so tight the bread had fused with the filling, and it cost a quarter less than everything above it. Ham salad was ground-up ham. Ends, trimmings, whatever the processor couldn't slice thin enough for the deli case, mixed with sweet pickle relish, mayonnaise, and just enough celery to call it a recipe. It came on white bread, always white, with no lettuce and no pretense. The men who bought it were the ones who forgot their pail, lost a bet, or just didn't care anymore. The sandwich sat in that machine for days sometimes, and when you unwrapped it, the bread peeled away from the filling like wallpaper off a damp wall. It was a negotiation with hunger, and hunger usually won. There comes a point where the food stops being about the meal and starts being about the man who carried it. Braunschweiger was Liverwurst's quieter, smokier cousin, the same ground pork liver and fat, but run through a smoking process that gave it a deeper color and a smell that announced itself the moment the wax paper came open. German-American factory workers in the Midwest spread it thick on pumpernickel or rye, sometimes with a slice of raw onion, and they ate it the way their fathers and grandfathers had. It was never popular outside those families. The grocery stores that carried it kept it in a small corner of the deli case, a section that shrank a little more every year. By the 2000s, Braunschweiger had all but disappeared from mainstream shelves, surviving only in regional delis and the memories of men who could still taste it decades after the last sandwich. The spread outlasted the factories. The men who ate it did not. Once a year, sometimes twice, the break room turned into a battlefield. Every man who thought he could cook brought in a slow cooker, plugged it into the power strip behind the coffee machine, and waited for the shift to weigh in. The chili cook-off wasn't sanctioned by management. It just happened through habit and stubbornness. One man swore by kidney beans and beer. Another used no beans at all and dared you to argue. Someone always brought a batch so hot it cleared sinuses and started a conversation about liability. The recipes were never written down, adjusted each year based on who won last time and what insult needed answering. The union steward usually judged, not because he had the best palate, but because nobody wanted to fight him. Wives sent cornbread. And for one afternoon, the break room smelled like cumin and competition instead of machine oil. Those cookoffs stopped when the plants downsized, and nobody officially ended them. They just didn't happen one year, and then they never happened again. Some factory cafeterias had a cook. Not a food service contractor, not a catering company, but a single person who showed up at 3 in the morning and started making food for a building full of people she knew by name. The stuffed peppers were hers. Green bells, cored and blanched, filled with ground beef, cooked rice, diced onion, and tomato sauce, baked until the peppers softened and the filling crusted at the edges. She made them because her mother made them, and her mother made them because they stretched a pound of beef into 6 servings. The recipe came from no book. It lived in the ratios she carried without thinking. A handful of this, a pour of that, a pinch of salt tested on the back of her hand. The men on night shift waited for stuffed pepper day the way other people waited for holidays, and when she retired after 22 years, the company replaced her with a contract service that shipped in pre-made trays. The peppers looked the same. Nothing about them tasted right. You could smell it before you saw it. A thick ring of smoked bologna, split down the middle and fried cut side down in a cast iron skillet until the edges curled and the fat rendered into a crackling pool. Ring bologna was a Midwest staple from Wisconsin to Iowa, made from a coarser grind of beef and pork, stuffed into a natural casing, smoked over hardwood, and tied into a loop that hung from a hook behind the butcher's counter. Factory workers carried it fried or cold, sliced into half moons and eaten on bread or straight from the wax paper with a pocket knife. The old German and Scandinavian families bought it by the ring. One for the week, hung on a nail in the pantry, sliced as needed. The small-town butcher shops that smoked their own have mostly closed. The factory-made versions survive in a few regional brands, but the taste, that char from real hardwood, that snap of natural casing, is harder to find with every year that passes. The percolator sat on a folding table near the time clock, and it had been running so long the coffee inside had gone past strong into something closer to tar, thick, bitter, with a film across the surface that caught the fluorescent light. Nobody brewed a fresh pot when the shift was done. You drank what was left, poured into a styrofoam cup that bent under the heat, standing up while you waited to punch out. The coffee break had been fought for, negotiated into contracts during the labor battles of the 40s and 50s, and by the 70s, it was as much a part of the factory as the machinery. But the last cup was different from the morning cup. The morning cup woke you up. The last cup was a ritual, a few minutes between the end of work and the drive home. Men stood in small groups near the door, not talking much, just holding the cup and letting the day drain out. That percolator was the last thing unplugged at night and the first thing plugged in next morning, and the coffee was terrible, and nobody who drank it would have traded it for anything. It was always in the same spot when you came downstairs, the black dome-top lunch pail on the counter, open and empty, the thermos beside it. He had already left. The pail smelled like whatever your mother packed the night before: cold coffee, wax paper, the ghost of a sandwich that no longer existed. You didn't think about it then. You were a kid, and the lunch pail was just part of the kitchen, ordinary as the clock on the wall. But it carried more than food. It carried a man's entire day, the weight of the shift, the rhythm of the break, the one meal that connected the factory floor to the kitchen table. 100 years of American labor moved through those pails, from the tin boxes of the 1880s to the steel domes of the 50s to the plastic shells of the 70s, and everyone came home empty. Your mother washed it, dried it, packed it again, every night, for years. The pail is in a closet now, or on a shelf in an antique shop with a price tag your father would have laughed at. But if you close your eyes, you can still smell it. The coffee, the wax paper, the quiet kitchen before anyone was awake. Ham and red-eye gravy is something that's considered a Southern classic. It has a really bold, salty personality, and it's a very no-nonsense flavor profile as well. This is a dish that takes country ham, which is typically dry-cured and goes the pan-frying route. The idea is to fry it until you see those dark brown edges crisping up in the pan. After that, you get an incredible flavor explosion in the form of concentrated pork drippings, and these then take a further unexpected turn. You start to pour in strong black coffee. Now I know you're about to fast forward 10 seconds, but hear me out, okay? The result isn't creamy or thick like you would expect. The coffee ends up deglazing the pan, and it creates this super thin reddish-brown gravy that has an unmistakable sheen to it. The result is a punchy, smoky, and bitter-tasting gravy, but not overwhelmingly bitter, and the coffee cuts through a lot of the richness of the ham fat. This is something you would see so commonly among rail workers in Tennessee and Alabama, especially if it was in the afternoon hours. The caffeine really helped with the job. Collard greens with fatback and cornbread was dinner for the field hands, sharecroppers, and black families carving out survival in the South. It was not fancy, but it was honest. The kind of food that came from the dirt and fed you well after a long day hunched over in the fields or doing hard labor in cotton mills. The greens simmered low and slow, softened in the pot, soaking up every ounce of flavor from that salty slab of fatback. Fatback was no luxury cut, but it did the trick. Salty, fatty, and just enough to transform a pot of greens into something hearty. You would cook the greens down for hours, tender and wilted till they practically melted in your mouth. The broth at the bottom, known as pot liquor, was almost the best part. It held all the smoky, rich flavor, and you would never let that go to waste. That is where the cornbread came in. Cornbread was the real sidekick here, fluffy or dense depending on who made it, always ready to soak up every last drop of pot liquor. Together, that plate was not just dinner, it was comfort, history, and survival all rolled into one. For generations, this meal kept people fed when options were few and life was harder than most could imagine. The egg salad sandwich is creamy, comforting, and unmistakably retro. Made from chopped hard-boiled eggs mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, maybe a dash of paprika or chopped celery, it's been a lunchtime standby for decades. Spread thickly onto white or wheat bread, it's soft enough to squish between your fingers but rich enough to feel like a meal. Grandmas packed them for road trips, office workers brought them in wax paper, and diners offered them as a cooling option on hot days. It wasn't fancy, but it was familiar, a quiet kind of indulgence. Every family had their own version, some chunkier, some smoother, some with green olives or scallions, others strictly plain. There's something nostalgic about the way it smells when you unwrap it, and the way the bread sticks just a little to the roof of your mouth. The egg salad sandwich never tried to compete with cold cuts. It just showed up, creamy and loyal, ready to carry you through till dinner. Stewed dried apples are something that smell like an old kitchen in the middle of fall. I'm talking about warm colors, scents, spices, and fruity notes galore. The apples are leathery slices, but you can also cut them up into the shape of rings for some extra visual flair. They get simmered really slowly in water, and when they plump back to life, they start to go really tender. These are super chewy at their core, and sugar, cinnamon, or just a little bit of clove will give them that extra weight they're missing. Stewed dried apples have been a pantry essential across many centuries, but particularly the 19th century in Southern America. That's because drying apples was the most standard way of keeping them all right before refrigeration came along. Salmon patties with white gravy is one of those meals working folks kept tucked away for a rainy day, and back then it rained a lot. Canned salmon was a pantry staple from Alaska to the Deep South because it was cheap, lasted forever, and stretched into something hearty enough for dinner. You would mix the salmon with breadcrumbs or leftover mashed potatoes, maybe an egg if you had one, form them into patties, and fry them up till golden. The magic was the milk gravy. You would pour that creamy white sauce right over bread, smother the patties, and the house filled with that warm, fried smell that meant you were eating good, even if payday was still a week away. Nobody mistook this for steak, but when your paycheck barely covered rent and the kids needed dinner, salmon patties showed up and did the job. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Cold potato with an onion salad was basically the chic way to go vegetarian back then. The dish had a subtle charm that heavily relied on the texture and seasoning. It was also ideally served chilled, because, well, science. I'm just kidding, but basically, the starch starts to firm up. This gives the potato a much more dense and sometimes waxy bite that contrasts really well with the creamy dressings. It also works spectacularly with the flavors present in an onion salad, which honestly adds the perfect crunchy element. Cold potatoes can feel like a mush fest after a few bites, so having some alternative textures in there really helps smoothen everything along. Historically, cold potato and onion salad is something we likely derived from 18th century Europe. This is a pretty traditional recipe in German and French circles, and leftover boiled potatoes were always dressed in oil, vinegar, and herbs so that waste could be avoided. American potato salads are something that evolved from these traditions, and they gained a lot of popularity by the time of the 20th century as a potluck, picnic, and community dinner staple. Stuffed green peppers with rice and ground beef looked fancier than it really was, which is probably why union working families loved it. You would hollow out green bell peppers, fill them with seasoned rice, chopped onions, sometimes breadcrumbs, and a small handful of ground beef. Just enough to flavor the whole thing without breaking the grocery budget. In tough times, especially for factory towns and mining families, you learned how to stretch meat as far as possible. The rice was there to bulk things up. The pepper held it all together, and with a bit of tomato sauce poured over top, it turned into a real sit-down dinner. You would bake them till the peppers got soft, the filling got savory, and suddenly dinner looked like it came from somewhere way fancier than your tiny kitchen. But that was the trick. It was affordable, filling, and made the table feel full even when paychecks felt light. Families who worked union jobs, pulled double shifts, or barely made rent kept recipes like this close because they turned leftovers into something to be proud of. Even today, folks will tell you their parents or grandparents lived off these stuffed peppers. Liverwurst sandwiches were bold. You knew it the moment someone unwrapped one across the table. That unmistakable scent, rich and meaty, mixed with sharp mustard or sliced onions, hit like a wave. The sandwich itself was unapologetically old school, usually served on rye or pumpernickel bread, often from a family who still shopped at the neighborhood butcher. Liverwurst was spreadable sausage, soft but full of iron and flavor, and it had no intention of going unnoticed. It was the sandwich your grandpa swore by, the one your parents either embraced or exiled. And for kids, it was a gamble, either a lunchroom legend or a quick trade for something with peanut butter. But for those who loved it, liverwurst was gold. It was hearty. It was grown up. It was tradition sliced thick and pressed between slices of something dark and sturdy. Liverwurst never begged for your approval. It knew it was not for everyone. Today, you hardly see it outside specialty stores and deli counters. But for a time, It was part of the rotation. Loved by few, remembered by all. Salted herring with potatoes is a dish that is built entirely on contrast. The briny meets the bland, and strong undertones meet soft aftertastes. The herring itself is something that's preserved in brine, right? So it's deeply flavored. It's firm when it comes to the flesh, it's slightly oily, and that tang isn't for everyone. But an honest-to-God seafood lover is going to enjoy the life out of it. The dish itself is something that's most commonly served cold, slightly warmed, or just with a side of elegant mashed potatoes. As elegant as they can be when they're made by a frustrated mom who just wants to get the table set up, really. A bit of chopped onion, sour cream, and dill, and you'll be remembering your mom's cooking soon enough. You know, salted herring with potatoes has always been something that's deeply considered a working-class regular, especially in the American Midwest and Northeast. It was so common to see this in coastal communities where fresh fish were always abundant. Preservation was something even kids could tell you about. Salted herring let families eat protein year-round, and potatoes were cheap and easy to grow, and they could be made into 1,000 different things. Fried bologna with cabbage and onions was how working families stretched meat, plain and simple. They called it the poor man's pork chop, and in a way, it kind of was. You would slice thick rounds of bologna, fry them until they blistered and curled at the edges, and slap them on a plate next to wilted cabbage and sweet caramelized onions. It was greasy, salty, and exactly what you needed after unloading rail cars or working a double shift at the mill. The cabbage came cheap and cooked down soft, soaking up all the juices. Bologna was one of those meats that kept showing up because it lasted long, cost little, and turned into something comforting with just a hot skillet and 5 minutes to spare. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. Bacon fat griddle cakes are something that are pretty much just pure, smoky nostalgia. They're the right kind of greasy. They're visually stunning, and they're full of so much flavor that you'll wonder why people stopped making these in the first place. The best part? They're so good to make on a budget. All that's required for this recipe is some flour, milk, eggs, and just a tad bit of cornmeal, sugar, and maybe molasses if you're really feeling like a dessert king. You're going to have got really old school with the griddle. You take leftover bacon grease instead of any butter or oil, and once your cake's shape is completely done, you just slap them on the griddle. What you get for all your hard, strenuous work is a very crispy-edged, savory and sweet pancake that has a lot of smokiness to it. Each bite feels like a crunch, but the exterior is what's really worth talking about. Obviously, you'd expect something like this to have a fluffy inside, but the exterior is just the perfect start to a delicious bite. Ham and potato scallop bake showed up on Midwest tables for one reason. Leftovers were gold, and smart families knew how to turn scraps into a meal worth sitting down for. You would slice potatoes thin, layer them in a baking dish with bits of leftover ham, drown the whole thing in a thin, creamy sauce made from milk or whatever you had, and bake it till bubbly and golden. It looked like one of those fancy all-day meals, but it came together fast because no one had the energy to cook for hours after a factory shift or hauling hay. That golden crust on top, the creamy sauce soaked into the potatoes, and salty ham tricked your brain into thinking dinner was fancier than it was. Midwest families leaned on dishes like this when meat was scarce, time was tighter, and every penny counted. It tasted like you worked all afternoon to make it, without doing that. If you ask someone to name one dish that describes diets during the Dust Bowl era, bean soup is the first meal that comes to mind. Beans have been man's best friend through some of the tensest times in history. They've been used in different kinds of meals through thick and thin. Bean soup was the classic bean dish of the 30s. Beans were cheap and easy to store, so they were a staple in many pantries. Bean soup could be made with any type of bean, and it was often thickened with cornmeal or bread. The simplicity of bean soup meant that it could be stretched to feed many people, and it provided a good source of protein and fiber. Bean soup might not have been the most exciting dish, but it was a staple of the Dust Bowl diet for a reason. It provided essential nutrition, was easy to make, and offered a bit of comfort and warmth. It was a reliable and nurturing meal that helped families get through some of the toughest times. Mutton fat bread is something that's unapologetically itself. It's too rich, too deep, and it has all the meaty flavors you could ask for. The essence of rendered sheep fat is unmistakable here. It's something that goes perfectly well with day-old bread, slightly dry, a bit hard, and coarse. You know, the entire 9 yards. This is as rustic of a dish as it gets. It absorbs the hot fat in this dish and it crisps on the outside while getting extremely soft on the inside. This dish is something that you would see really commonly whenever you would pass by factory towns or farms, especially among rural laborers, such as people in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were sheep farming regions like the Appalachia, Wales, or the Highlands, and mutton fat was an extremely common ingredient in these areas. That's because it was always far more cheaper than butter, or just a lot more flavorful than lard. The ideal material for frying. The fried bread was also a good way for people to stretch meals, and although some people didn't vibe with the overly gamey taste, back then it was considered a standard of most red meat-based meals. Meat scrapple with eggs might sound odd if you never grew up near Pennsylvania, but for the folks there, it was survival food turned tradition. Scrapple was how the Pennsylvania Dutch made sure nothing went to waste. Every pork trimming and leftover bit of meat boiled down with cornmeal, flour, and spices until it turned into this thick loaf of meat mush. Let it chill, slice it, fry it till crispy edges formed, and there you had it. A no-frills dinner ready to fill you up after long hours on the job. Pair it with fried eggs, maybe some potatoes if you had them, and that was supper done right. It was humble but practical, and working-class families knew better than to waste even a scrap. Scrapple stretched the butcher bill, turned bones and trimmings into breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and carried folks through the rough stretches when factory work paid little and farm life was hard. The crispy outside, soft inside, salty flavor, none of it was gourmet, but all of it was comforting. That was the point. You ate what you had, made it stretch, and kept going. Rolled flank steak was a much less expensive cut of beef. A lot of protein like fish and canned ham were used, but people couldn't really replace the need for beef. Of course, they had to make do. But that meant another thing. Less popular cuts of meat, ones that people normally wouldn't give a second glance to, became a lot more in demand. Naturally, you'd think that would mean they'd raise the prices, right? Not really, because then people would just buy the beef. Flank steak in particular was tougher and a lot more rubbery, but it was also really tender when you would slow cook it. It also helped matters that most home chefs knew their way pretty intimately around slow cooking. Next, you'd do whatever you could to make sure that the beef would last as long as possible. It was usually common to serve rolled flank steak with stuffing to make a pretty neat dish that required minimal beef. The stuffing itself was made from economy loaves, vegetables, and different kinds of herbs. An otherwise small and pretty hard-to-chew piece of meat would become a meal the whole family could look forward to, if you were willing to invest the hours it would take to make something of it. Most people were just happy to eat beef, though, which made the prep work just a bit more bearable. Beef kidney stew is a rich, earthy dish that has a lot to bring to the table. Bold, distinctly old-fashioned flavors, and more protein than your muscles probably know what to do with. It gives a really deep umami base. It has a little bit of a mineral flavor, slightly metallic. You know, that's par for the course when you're dealing with actual meat. But you throw this into a skillet with some slow-cooked onions, garlic, red wine, and bay leaves, and you'll end up with this incredibly exotic-looking stew. Dark, glossy, and full of flavor, it's something that has a velvety texture also, thanks to being thickened by flour. The chunks of soft, tender carrot and potato in there also give it an incredible contrast that the dish really needs. Now, historically, this has always been a staple of the working class, especially when you go into the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, beef kidney stew is something that's not really relevant outside of the usual TikTok bringing back age-old recipes. Potato and hot dog hash might sound like a last resort meal, and honestly, that is exactly what it was. But when times were lean, it worked better than most meals. You would chop those potatoes small, fry them till crispy and golden in leftover bacon grease or whatever you had, then toss in sliced hot dogs and onions. Maybe you had onions, maybe you did not. It depended on the paycheck that week and what the pantry held by Thursday. This was salty, starchy, and fast. The kind of dinner you threw together before clocking in for a night shift or scarfed down cold after a 12-hour day. Blue-collar homes leaned on this more than they liked to admit, especially during hard winters or when the factory cut hours. It was one skillet, no extra mess, no extra money, and that was the beauty of it. Potatoes were cheap, hot dogs lasted forever in the fridge, and even when groceries were low, you could stretch this meal for the whole family. Nobody left hungry, and that was all that counted. Milk toast was one of the humblest but most beloved comfort foods of the Depression. Families would toast slices of bread, often stale or homemade, and soak them in warm milk flavored with sugar or a pinch of salt. The softened bread took on a custard-like texture that children especially enjoyed, while adults valued its warmth and simplicity. Milk toast was often served for breakfast or supper when cupboards were bare, providing a soothing, filling option that used ingredients most homes had on hand. It was easy to digest, which also made it a common food for the elderly and the sick. In households where milk was scarce, families watered it down, making it stretch further while still preserving the spirit of the dish. Milk toast was never glamorous, but it carried the weight of familiarity and comfort, reminding people that even the plainest foods could feel nurturing. It is remembered today not for extravagance, but for the quiet reassurance it gave in the hardest times. Pork neck bone stew sounds humble, and honestly it was, but it was rich, gelatinous, and proof that you could make something out of almost nothing. Neck bones were cheap, tough, and bony, which is why working families bought them. But if you had patience, you could turn those scraps into a stew that stuck to your ribs and made a few dollars stretch. You would simmer them for hours till the meat loosened right off the bone and the broth thickened into something hearty. In went carrots, potatoes, onions, and whatever greens you had lying around. Every family had their own twist, but the bones were always the backbone, pun intended, of the dish. It filled bowls, bellies, and kept you going when grocery shelves were bare and pay barely covered rent. The South lived off stews like this, from farms to tiny towns, where folks stretched every penny into meals that fed the whole house. It was bony, but nobody cared once it was ready. When you are working sunrise to sunset, that thick bowl of stew at home was enough to remind you that simple food, made with patience, could carry you through the hardest days. Peanut soup was a filling option that came straight out of the need for protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Ground peanuts simmered with water or milk created a creamy, nutty broth that was surprisingly hearty. Onions, celery, or a bit of leftover potato might be added to give it body, but the peanuts did most of the heavy lifting. The flavor was rich enough that it almost felt indulgent, even though it cost very little to prepare. Served with cornbread or biscuits if available, it could stretch into a complete meal for an entire family. Many households in the South relied on peanuts as a cheap crop, and this soup was a natural way to put them to use. For many children who grew up during the Depression, peanut soup became a nostalgic memory of warmth and survival, showing how simple ingredients could stand in for things they could not afford. Rolled oats and bacon are a really humble and delicious combination. It does two things very perfectly. It balances the comfort of a cream-heavy dish with the allure of smoky flavors. Now, that's not very hard to do, but I think when a dish makes that work, it's always one for the Notes app. The oats are something you simmer slowly in water and milk. You know, the usual preparation. You have to wait until it becomes completely porridge, though. Stir in these crisp crumbles of bacon, and suddenly the dish transforms into a wonderful savory fantasy. You get to have this decadent texture with just the tiniest bits of smoky aftertaste, and it makes for a dish that just feels like the perfect autumn or winter breakfast. Historically, though, this is a dish that you would actually find more often in the summer times, when people were really trying to stretch out their meals and scraping for protein. Especially in the early 20th century, when rationing meant that almost everyone had to think conservatively about what they were eating and how much of it they were using. The savory oats bowl couldn't ever go mainstream, but I think that suits the quiet nature of the dish. Cornmeal mush with fried salt pork was the Depression-era meal that just never really left hard-working kitchens. It started as a necessity for miners, factory workers, and sharecroppers, but turned into one of those stovetop comforts families relied on. Cornmeal mush sounds fancy, but it was basically cornmeal boiled into a soft, sliceable block. Fry it up in bacon grease or butter, if you had any, and you had crispy edges with a creamy center that soaked up everything. Now, fried salt pork? That was survival meat. Salty, fatty, and cheap, it crackled in the pan and gave that humble cornmeal some serious flavor. It was not pretty, but it filled bellies fast. And when you had 4 hungry mouths at the table, that was all that mattered. So fried cornmeal mush with syrup was this really golden, crispy edge throwback to times where meals like this counted as a wonderful breakfast. It was made from what was essentially just a chilled polenta, or otherwise known as cornmeal mush. You would slice these into thick slabs, pan-fry them until the outside was a complete crackling crust, and then the inside would stay really soft, dense, and creamy. Topping these with a bit of drizzle, sorghum and maple would complete the experience, and you would be enjoying a beautiful contrast of textures, flavors, and the crunchiness of it all. Cornmeal is a deeply hearty dish. It's something that sticks with you, and the nutty flavors help with that. This was a dish that was so common amongst Midwestern farm families and Southern homes throughout the 1800s and 1940s, and that was partially because cornmeal was so abundant that people just made up different versions of similar dishes. You will find it in old cookbooks, certain off-road diners that really try to stick to the whole mid-90s vibe, and Southern homes, but it's largely something that just doesn't get much traction anymore. Even still, cornmeal mush was amazing, and deserves to have its name in the Hall of Fame of easy, convenient breakfasts you can rely on. Hominy and pinto beans were one of those humble meals that quietly fed working families all across the Southwest, especially when times were lean and hours were long. Hominy, if you never had it, is just dried corn that has been treated with lime to puff up and soften. A native-inspired staple that has been filling bellies for generations. You would cook it slow with pinto beans, salt, maybe some onions or lard if you had extra, and suddenly you had dinner bubbling away that cost next to nothing but kept you full for hours. It was simple, cheap, and perfect for folks doing backbreaking shifts in the fields or on construction crews under the desert sun. Beans and hominy stored easy, traveled well, and stretched for big families, which is probably why they stuck around long after fancier meals came and went. It might not look fancy on a plate, but that bowl of soft beans, chewy corn, and rich broth could keep a working person moving when there was no other option. Enough of all this savory stuff. Let's go towards something that's actually sweet. Believe it or not, people had incredible tricks and tips for that. One of those was a rice and molasses bowl, which is the kind of dish that just inspires gentle waves of nostalgia in you. It's something that's drizzled with thick, dark molasses. The molasses, which makes for a very bittersweet, smoky bite with sweet undertones, tends to seep into the grains. This actually gives them such a nice autumn-coated color that really just makes you want to set up your best sheet in a park, call a few friends, and enjoy the small things in life. Historically, though, this was nothing that was so romantic. It was a poor man's breakfast and dessert, especially in most parts of the South and the Appalachian regions. It was very common to see among working-class Northeasterns in the 18th century, and it was something that was relied on to stretch ingredients when things were running low. This is because molasses was always really cheap and bought in bulk, and if people weren't growing their rice, they were stocking up on as much as they could. Rice, molasses, and different kinds of bowls are now bygones of different times, but they were really good. Boiled dinner with cabbage, carrots, and sausage was the one-pot lifesaver for big families all over New England, especially when paychecks were stretched thin. It was plain food, sure, but it was hearty, cheap, and filling, which is exactly what you needed after a full day hauling crates on the docks or working the mills. You would toss cabbage wedges, carrots, potatoes, and whatever sausage you could afford into a pot, cover it with water, and let it simmer for hours. By the time it was done, everything was soft, flavorful, and ready to fill plates fast. Sometimes you had bread on the side, sometimes not. But either way, no one walked away from the table hungry. It was not the prettiest dinner, but when there were 8 mouths to feed and only a few dollars to do it, boiled dinner came through. Those kitchens went quiet a long time ago. If any of them fed your family, leave a comment and tell us which one.